The keys hit the farmhouse table with the finality of a judge's gavel, echoing through rooms that had held 3 generations of quiet morning prayers and Sunday suppers. The wind hadn't stopped howling for 3 days. It carved through the wheat stubble like a blade, sending tumbleweeds skittering across what used to be Silas McKenna's land. Now it belonged to First National Bank of Kansas, along with the mortgage papers, the rusted John Deere in the machine shed, and 30 years of his life. He stood in the kitchen doorway, duffel bag heavy in his weathered hands, listening to the storm rattle the windows. The linoleum floor bore the ghost marks of where his grandmother's table had sat for decades. 4 perfect indentations that would outlast him, outlast the bank, maybe outlast the house itself. The morning light filtering through dust-caked glass cast everything in sepia, like an old photograph already fading. The eviction notice still hung on the front door, corners flapping in the wind like a wounded bird. 30 days, it had said. He'd used 29 of them sitting in that kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the same golden path across the same empty fields, waiting for a miracle that never came. The drought had taken the crops. The hospital bills from Martha's cancer had taken the savings. The bank had taken everything else with the cold efficiency of a combine harvester. His pickup truck waited in the drive, engine ticking in the morning chill. Everything he owned now fit in 2 bags and a cardboard box. 47 years old, and his whole life could be loaded in 10 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades accumulating things, fixing things, building things, only to discover how little of it actually mattered when the world decided to wash you away. The barn doors hung open, creaking on their hinges with each gust. He'd meant to secure them before he left, but what was the point? Let the wind have its way. Let it all fall down. He'd already walked through those stalls one last time, running his hands along the worn wood where his father had carved initials, where he'd carved his own as a boy dreaming of the day this place would be his. Dreams had a way of curdling in your mouth when you weren't looking. A photograph sat on the windowsill, him and Martha on their wedding day, standing in front of the barn with their whole lives ahead of them. She'd wanted to keep bees, had drawn up plans for hives along the south fence. "Honey," she'd said, "is the only thing that never spoils." The cancer had spoiled everything else. Even her laughter, toward the end, had sounded thin and brittle. The truck's radio crackled with weather warnings. Severe thunderstorm watch. Hail possible. High winds. As if the sky hadn't already done enough damage. Silas threw his bag into the bed and climbed behind the wheel. The engine turned over with a cough that sounded like his own these days, rough, tired, but still running. He didn't look at the house as he backed down the drive. Didn't let his eyes drift to the garden where Martha's roses still bloomed wild and untended. Didn't acknowledge the porch swing where they'd spent evenings planning a future that would never come. The rearview mirror showed only the road ahead, and that was how it had to be. But as he reached the county road, lightning split the sky like an axe through kindling. The thunder followed, so close it seemed to shake the earth beneath his tires. In the distance, something large and dark crashed through the storm. A tree limb, maybe, or part of the barn roof. The sound carried on the wind, a groan of wood and metal surrendering to forces beyond their control. Silas pressed harder on the accelerator, but his hands were trembling on the wheel. That sound, he'd heard it before, years ago, when a twister had taken the Hensley place 3 counties over. The sound of a life collapsing all at once, instead of the slow bleed he'd been living with. His foot eased off the gas. The truck slowed, then stopped on the shoulder. In the rearview mirror, the farmhouse sat small and vulnerable against the storm. Something was wrong, more wrong than just the wind and rain. A darkness had settled over the barn that didn't belong to the weather. Smoke, maybe. Or dust. Or something else entirely. He told himself to keep driving. Whatever was happening back there wasn't his problem anymore. The keys were on the kitchen table. The papers were signed. He was done being responsible for things that couldn't be saved. But the truck was already turning around, gravel crunching under the tires as it swung back toward the farm. Some habits, Silas thought grimly, died harder than others. The barn door hung at an impossible angle, one hinge torn clean away by the fallen oak branch. Rain drove through the gap in diagonal sheets, turning the packed earth floor to soup. Silas stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hat brim, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The old oak, the one his grandfather had planted the year he'd bought the land, lay across the barn like a giant's arm reaching through the roof. Its trunk, easily 3 feet across, had punched through the rafters and brought down half the loft. Hay bales scattered like children's blocks. The sweet smell of wet straw mixed with something else, something that made his stomach clench. Fear. The smell of a terrified animal. He picked his way through the debris, boots squelching in the mud. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the chaos in stark relief. Feed sacks split open, grain spilling across the floor in golden streams. The old milking stool his father had made, now kindling under the oak's weight. And there, in the far corner where the shadows pooled deepest, something moved. Not the scurrying of mice or the flutter of barn swallows. Something larger, breathing hard, trying to stay invisible. "Easy," Silas said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the hidden creature or himself. His voice sounded strange in the storm-damaged space, hollow and uncertain. "Easy, now." He approached slowly, hands visible, the way his father had taught him with spooked cattle. The shape in the corner shifted, and he caught a glimpse of something that stopped him cold. An eye, wide and dark and filled with the kind of terror that came from being forgotten. It was a horse. A draft mare, by the look of her, though age and neglect had carved her down to bone and shadow. Her coat was the color of wet earth, dull and matted with mud. She'd been tied in the corner behind the feed sacks, tied and left there, probably when the bank had come to inventory the livestock. Only they'd missed her, hidden in the shadows, and whoever had left her there had either forgotten or simply didn't care. The rope around her neck was embedded in a tangle of fallen timber. She'd been struggling against it, probably for hours, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Foam flecked her muzzle, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that misted in the cold air. "Jesus," Silas whispered. "How long have you been here, girl?" The mare flinched at his voice but didn't try to run. She was too tired, too defeated. He'd seen that look before. In the mirror, most mornings, and in Martha's eyes during those last weeks when the medicine stopped working. The look of something that had given up fighting but wasn't quite ready to die. He knelt in the mud beside her, careful not to make any sudden movements. The rope was old hemp, swollen with moisture and pulled tight by her struggles. His fingers, stiff with cold and arthritis, fumbled with the knots. The mare watched him with those dark eyes, as if trying to decide whether this was another cruelty or something else entirely. "I know," he said softly, working at the rope. "I know how it feels." The words surprised him. He hadn't talked to anyone, not really talked, since Martha's funeral 6 months ago. The neighbors had brought casseroles and condolences, but they'd spoken around him, not to him, as if grief was contagious. After a while, he'd stopped trying to respond. It was easier to be invisible, to let people think he was managing fine on his own. But this horse, she was listening. Really listening, the way Martha used to when he'd come in from the fields with some small triumph or disaster to share. The way no one had listened since. Thunder rolled overhead, and the mare's ears flicked nervously. The storm was getting worse, if that was possible. Through the broken roof, Silas could see the clouds churning like a pot of black soup. They needed to get out of here before the rest of the building came down. He worked faster at the rope, his fingers finding purchase on the wet fibers. One strand came loose, then another. The mare's breathing eased slightly as the pressure on her neck lessened. "That's it," he murmured. "Almost there." Behind him, something crashed in the wind, a sheet of corrugated metal torn from the machine shed by the sound of it. This whole place was coming apart at the seams, 30 years of careful maintenance undone in a single night. But for the first time in months, Silas didn't care about the destruction. All that mattered was the knot under his fingers and the trust building in the mare's dark eyes. The last strand parted with a wet snap. The rope fell away, and the mare's head came up, free for the first time in hours. She could have bolted then, could have trampled him in her panic to reach the door. Instead, she stayed perfectly still, as if she understood that they were in this together now. Silas sat back on his heels, rain dripping down his neck, and looked at the horse. Really looked at her. Beneath the mud and neglect, she was beautiful. A Percheron, maybe, or a mix. The kind of horse his grandfather would have admired, built for work but gentle enough for a child to lead. Someone had cared for her once. Someone had braided ribbons in her mane and fed her apples from their palm. Now she was here, forgotten and afraid, just like him. "What's your name, girl?" he asked, reaching out slowly to touch her neck. Her skin was warm under his palm, alive and real in a way nothing had felt for months. "What do we call you?" The mare nickered softly, the first sound she'd made. It was barely a whisper, but it carried more hope than anything Silas had heard since the day the doctor had told him there was nothing more they could do. Outside, the storm raged on. But in the broken barn, man and horse stood together in the rain, both of them learning what it meant to not be alone. The mare's ribs showed through her coat like fence posts in winter. Silas ran his hands along her flanks, feeling the sharp edges of bone beneath the dull hair, and something twisted in his chest. When had he last eaten a real meal? When had he last looked at himself in a mirror and seen something worth saving? He found an old horse blanket in the tack room. Martha's blanket, the blue one she'd bought for the pony they'd never had children to ride. It smelled of lavender and mothballs, and for a moment he could almost hear her voice. "Don't you dare throw that away, Silas McKenna. We might need it someday." Someday had arrived 20 years late, but it had arrived. The mare stood quietly as he draped the blanket over her back. Her head hung low, not from docility but from exhaustion. Every line of her body spoke of resignation, of hopes worn down to nothing. She'd given up expecting kindness, the way he'd given up expecting anything but more loss. "I know that feeling," he said, adjusting the blanket's edge. His voice echoed strangely in the damaged barn, mixing with the steady drip of rain through the broken roof. "The world just keeps taking pieces of you until you're not sure there's anything left worth keeping." Lightning flickered again, casting wild shadows across the walls. In the brief illumination, Silas caught sight of himself in the old mirror that hung by the grain bins, a cracked piece of glass that had been there since his father's time. The man looking back at him was a stranger, hollow-cheeked, gray-bearded, with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. He looked away quickly, but the image stayed with him. When had he become so thin? When had his shoulders started to curve inward, as if he was trying to disappear into himself? The mare's condition was obvious. Anyone could see she'd been neglected. But his own decline had been so gradual he'd stopped noticing. "We make quite a pair," he said, settling down on an overturned feed bucket. The mare's ears twitched toward him. "Two old broken-down things that nobody wants any more." But even as he said it, something in his chest rebelled against the words. The mare wasn't broken. She was hurt, abandoned, but not broken. Beneath the neglect, he could see the proud arch of her neck, the intelligent alertness in her eyes. Someone had trained her well, once upon a time. Someone had loved her. He pulled out his phone, its screen cracked from too many drops on the barn floor, and scrolled through his contacts. Dr. Henley, the vet, was still listed there. He'd treated their cattle for 15 years before the herd had to be sold. Good man. Honest prices. But the phone had no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell tower, and the landline in the house had been disconnected a week ago. The mare shifted, testing her weight on legs that trembled with weakness. She needed food, water, medical attention. She needed someone to care whether she lived or died. The parallel hit him like a physical blow. In the corner, water dripped steadily into an old coffee can, the sound rhythmic as a heartbeat. Silas found himself counting the drops, the way he'd counted pills in those last weeks with Martha. Measuring time in small, meaningless increments because the big picture was too overwhelming to face. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said to the mayor, who was watching him with those dark, patient eyes. "That last morning with Martha. She was so weak she could barely lift her head, but she made me promise something. Made me promise I wouldn't give up on myself after she was gone." The mayor nickered softly, and the sound seemed to encourage him to continue. "I promised her, you know. Looked her right in the eye and swore I'd keep going, keep living. But I haven't, have I? I've just been existing, waiting for it to be over." He stood up, his knees protesting, and walked to the broken window. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The wind still howled, but the rain had gentled from a driving assault to a steady wash. In the distance, the farmhouse sat dark and abandoned, the eviction notice probably torn away by now. 29 days, he said to his reflection in the wet glass. 29 days I sat in that kitchen feeling sorry for myself, watching the sunrise like it was a personal insult, like the world was being cruel by continuing to turn without Martha in it. He turned back to the mayor, who was still watching him with that steady gaze. "But you know what? She loved those sunrises. Used to drag me out of bed before dawn just to watch the light come up over the wheat fields. 'Look at that,' she'd say. 'Look how the whole world gets born again every single day.' I thought she was being dramatic, but maybe she was trying to tell me something." The mare took a tentative step toward him, the blanket shifting on her back. Her movement was careful, uncertain, but there was something in it that spoke of possibility. Of trust, maybe, or at least the willingness to try trusting again. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to the farmhouse. They felt heavier than they should, weighted with all the memories they represented. He'd been so eager to leave them behind, to walk away from everything that reminded him of loss. But standing here in the ruined barn with this forgotten horse, he began to understand that running away from grief was like running away from love. Impossible, because they were two sides of the same coin. "What if," he said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them, "what if Martha wasn't trying to make me promise to survive? What if she was trying to make me promise to live?" The mare whinnied then, a sound that was part greeting, part plea. It was the sound of something that had been voiceless finding its voice again. And in that moment, Silas felt something crack open inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like a seed that had been buried too long finally splitting apart to let in the light. He walked over to the mare and gently stroked her neck. Under his touch, he could feel her heartbeat, strong and steady despite everything she'd endured. Life, insistent and stubborn and refusing to quit. "Okay, girl," he said softly. "Okay. We're going to figure this out. Both of us." Outside, the first break in the clouds appeared, and a shaft of sunlight slanted through the broken roof, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, like hope made visible. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Silas stood in the barnyard at first light, watching the mare crop grass in the paddock he'd spent the night repairing. She moved carefully, favoring her left hind leg, but her head was up and her ears were pricked forward with interest rather than fear. Dr. Henley had arrived at dawn, driving his battered pickup through the muddy tracks left by the storm. He was a man of few words, but his hands were gentle as he examined the mare, and his verdict was cautiously optimistic. "Dehydrated, malnourished, but strong underneath it all," he'd said, preparing a series of injections. "Good bones, good heart. With proper care, she'll come around." He'd looked at Silas then, his weathered face serious. "Question is, you planning to provide that care?" Silas had nodded without hesitation, surprising himself with the certainty in the gesture. Yes, I am. Now, 3 hours later, he was rebuilding a life he'd thought was over. The mare, Belle, he'd decided to call her, after Martha's middle name, had already put on weight from the sweet feed and hay he'd found in the grain elevator's emergency supply. Not much, but enough to put a little flesh on her ribs and a little light in her eyes. The bank representative had called while he was mucking out Belle's stall. A young woman with a professionally sympathetic voice, wondering if he'd cleared out of the property yet. The eviction notice had blown away in the storm, she explained, but the deadline remained the same. About that, Silas had said, leaning on his pitchfork and watching Belle nose around the fresh bedding. I'd like to discuss a payment plan. The silence on the other end had been telling. Mr. McKenna, we've been through this. The mortgage is 3 months behind. The farm isn't viable as it stands. What if it wasn't just a farm anymore? That had gotten her attention. Silas had found himself explaining an idea that had been forming in his mind since he'd first looked into Belle's eyes. A sanctuary, he told her. A place for abandoned and neglected horses, funded by donations and volunteer work. The barn would need repairs, but the bones were good. The pastures needed reseeding, but the soil was still rich beneath the drought-damaged surface. There's a need for it, he'd said, thinking of the mare and wondering how many others were out there, forgotten and afraid. More than you might think. The bank representative had promised to discuss it with her supervisor. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was possibility, fragile as a new foal but real nonetheless. Now, as the sun climbed higher, Silas found himself making lists. Feed suppliers to contact. Veterinarian bills to budget for. Volunteer organizations to reach out to. The magnitude of what he was considering should have overwhelmed him, but instead it felt like waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. He was measuring fence posts when the first visitors arrived. Tom Brewster from the neighboring farm pulled up in his truck, followed by Sarah Chen from the feed store in town. Then the Kowalski family, the ones who ran the farmers' market. Word had spread, the way it did in small communities, about the storm and the horse and the man who'd decided to stay. "Heard you might need some help," Tom said, pulling work gloves from his back pocket. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He'd brought his post-hole digger and a thermos of coffee that smelled like heaven. Sarah had brought feed samples and a business card for a horse rescue organization 3 counties over. "They've got experience with this sort of thing," she said. "Might be able to offer advice, maybe even help with fundraising." The Kowalskis had brought their teenage daughter Emma, who took one look at Belle and fell in love. "Can I help with her?" she asked, her eyes shining. "I've been saving up for riding lessons, but maybe I could work here instead?" By noon, the barn was full of people. Some were there to work, replacing boards, cleaning stalls, hauling away storm debris. Others had come simply to see what was happening, drawn by curiosity and the inexplicable magnetism of a second-chance story. Silas found himself in the center of it all, directing efforts and answering questions, feeling more useful than he had in months. This was what Martha had meant, he realized. Not just surviving, but living. Not just enduring, but creating something meaningful from the wreckage. "You know," said Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store, pausing in her sweep of the barn aisle, "Martha would be proud of this." The words hit him like a physical blow, but not in the way he'd expected. Instead of the usual sharp stab of grief, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. Martha would be proud. She'd always believed in the power of small kindnesses, in the way one person's courage could ripple outward and touch other lives. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the volunteers began to drift away, promising to return tomorrow and the next day. The barn, which had been a wreck that morning, now looked like a place where healing could happen. The roof was still damaged, but it was covered with tarps. The stalls were clean and ready for occupants. The fence line was solid. Belle stood in her paddock, no longer alone. The Kowalskis had left their old gelding, Chester, in the adjacent field, a temporary arrangement that had become permanent when the two horses had struck up an immediate friendship. They grazed side by side now, their contentment visible in every line of their bodies. Silas walked the fence line as the sun set, checking his work and marveling at the transformation. 24 hours ago, he'd been a man with no future, driving away from the only life he'd ever known. Now he was the founder of what Sarah Chen was already calling McKenna's Hope, a sanctuary for horses that had nowhere else to go. His phone buzzed. A text from the bank representative, supervisor interested in proposal. "Can you come in Monday to discuss terms?" He typed back quickly, "Yes. Thank you." But as he hit send, he realized the thanks wasn't just for the meeting. It was for the storm that had brought Belle into his life, for the community that had rallied around an idea born from desperation and hope, for Martha, who had loved him enough to make him promise to keep living. The sun was setting behind the wheat fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Belle nickered softly from her paddock, and Silas walked over to stroke her neck. She was putting on weight already, he noticed. Her coat was beginning to show hints of the rich chestnut it would become with proper care. "What do you think, girl?" he asked. "Think we can make this work?" Belle nuzzled his shoulder, and in that simple gesture, Silas found his answer. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and hard work and moments of doubt. But it was a future worth fighting for. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to tomorrow. If Silas's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet strength that lives in ordinary people, or if it sparked hope in the middle of your own difficult journey, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that second chances are real. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that kindness still lives, even in the most unlikely places. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of new beginnings.